many times when I would get to know somebody, this was almost always after more than one visit.
Yes.
The person, I would say, I think you might be grieving because you've lost a lot. And a lot of times it would be, well, nobody died. Like, well, but there's other types of loss. There's shadow losses. And that, I think, was in a moment where, for myself as a chaplain, where, that's proof in the pudding of the importance of grief literacy.
Yes.
Because if you just give people some more vocabulary, words make the world easier to navigate when you have a word or a name for something, and it saves emotional labor when you can just say, this was a shadow loss or what have you.
It saves self-gaslighting,
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And basically what that is giving anybody a word is giving them a tool in their toolbox. And they can choose whether or not to use that word to describe their own lived experience. And I think that is how I would answer that question. That was probably very simple. It's the little stuff. It's just taking the time to listen and then say, hey, have you heard of this thing? Do you think that describes you?
Hello, my grieving friends. It's your host, Lisa Keefauver here. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Now, just in case you're new to the show, yes, this is a podcast all about grief. We explore the expansiveness and the pervasiveness of grief in our lives because, let's face it, 100% of us will experience grief multiple times in our lives. But what I've learned over my 20 plus years as a social worker and the more than a decade I've spent now as a widow is that if we lean in, hold space, and bear witness for one another in the most truly challenging times in our lives, that's where true connection, healing, and community building happens. Now, I'm curious, have you ever heard of Thanatology? Are you curious what it's like to be a chaplain? How about what it's like to do that work inside of a jail? I'm thrilled to welcome Cole Imperi, a clinically trained chaplain thanatologist who worked in one of America's 25 largest jails. In our conversation today, she explores the multifaceted nature of grief, loss, and bereavement, particularly in the context of cultural perspectives and the prison system. Cole shares personal experiences with grief from an early age, discusses the importance of understanding shadow losses, and highlights the unique challenges faced by individuals in incarceration. Now, Cole and I share a passion for grief literacy and the vulnerability of grievers, advocating for a compassionate approach to supporting those navigating loss. This passion led her to write A Guide to Grief, a book specifically designed to help young people and their caregivers become more grief literate. Welcome, Cole, to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. It's so beautiful to have you here today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to get to participate in this project that you have been shepherding for years.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know I'm still like, what? This is season 6. You're listening to this episode probably towards the end of season 6. And we've gotten to cross paths a few times briefly, IRL, as the kids say, at Endwell and various events, but this will be our first time really getting to dive deep into these subjects that you and I both love to talk about, and hopefully our listeners do too. That's why they're tuning in today. But we're going to explore, as the listeners heard at the top of the show, your really interesting and incredible professional experience with grief and death and loss and accompanying people in all kinds of settings, from incarceration, global, etc. But I want to ground us where I like to ground every conversation over the past 6 seasons, and that's inviting you to help us understand where your grief beliefs originated. And for all of us, we have them, whether or not we ever name the word grief, comes usually from an early experiences with loss and learning from generally the adults in our life or just sort of the culture around us. What did you learn about from the implicit and explicit messages around that first loss event for you about what grief, should or shouldn't be or feel like? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, Deer Park, Ohio, shout out. And
Go Midwest.
And as a kid, I was very comfortable with grief and loss for some reason. I did not come from a family that was particularly touchy-feely. I was the kid that had the feelings. Okay. So that's where we're coming from. And one of my first memories was my childhood best friend, Katie. Her dog, Moose, died. And I grew up in and around a veterinary office because my mom worked in and around and with animals my whole life. And so as a kid, when I was home from school sick, I would be in the vet office and I used to watch surgeries. And then when an animal would die, one of the earliest memories I have was helping to deal with the body of the pet and put it in the back room for, storage until it was picked up or what have you. So that was very comfortable around that without, I think, any adult trying. Like that wasn't like no adult was like, we want to make sure like Cole's really comfortable. It was just kind of like I was there and I got involved. And that first experience was pet loss. And that remains to this day something that I care a lot about, think a lot about, and I advocate for people allowing themselves to grieve as deeply as they need to grieve over the loss of a pet because it's hard.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things that I really appreciate there. I always love it when somebody answers that question around a different kind of loss than we typically think. Sometimes it's a non-death loss. I once had a poet share that her first memory of loss was a tree that a family member purposely and harmfully destroyed, and the way she felt about that. So I love that you're bringing in pet loss, which I have lost a few of my own. So I think I appreciate the reminder to expand our permissions that we give ourselves and one another. But also something that you brought up there, I feel maybe foreshadowing a conversation we might have later on in the podcast about culture, which is nobody has to sit down and tell you this is normal, this is a part of life, this is the life cycle, because that was just what you were exposed to. And I've been thinking a lot lately, and interestingly enough, talked about this with my last guest that I recorded with earlier today, that we have an intuitive, like our ancestors and the way we've lived for most of our time in human history, we have a knowing about the normalcy of grief and loss and bereavement and caring for the dying and the dead. And so it wasn't something that had to be taught. It was just like we absorbed it as a part of our everyday life and culture. But what has happened now is that it's so eschewed and so tried to be buried that now we feel like we have to have a formal education around grief. Does that feel,
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a pendulum effect at play here, particularly in the United States, where I'd say over the last probably 30 years, we've kind of in the United States, in terms of if you encompass all death, dying, grief, loss, bereavement, we've swung more into this science academia. We've sciencified and academified it. But it wasn't like that. This is a recent thing. This is kind of a blip. And I'm particularly interested in the non-clinical side of things that has always been there and will continue to be there. And I think it's interesting to think about these recent developments that we are all privileged to be able as a society to be able to develop scientifically and academically. Because in order to spend time and resources doing that, that requires a culture and a society to be stable.
Yes.
And so we're very lucky that that is the situation that we're in. However, there's been, at least in my neck of the woods, a lot of interest in people wanting to connect with how, like, these traditions, tools, and techniques that we've always had in place.
Yeah, when we think about sort of whatever cultures across the globe have, sort of indigenous or, culturally local practices, belief, skill sets, honoring ceremonies, et cetera. And we're having to sort of grasp backwards towards those things.
Yes.
In our sort of capitalized modern era, especially in the West, although I think that has had a global ripple for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and we'll dive deeper into that later on. I'm thinking about one of the things that, as I spent some time with you, even though we weren't together, meaning I was reading your beautiful new book, A Guide to Grief, and just watching some of your TED Talks and just getting to know you a little before we got together, was your work and your role working around bereavement and grief in the prison system. It's something I've talked about and taught about when I taught a course on loss and grief at University of Texas for a few years. and have done a little bit of reading, but I'd love to explore, your role. I think you were a prison chaplain. Was that your title in your time? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think wherever you want to go with that, I want to offer, but I think as part of the conversation, I'd love to learn a little bit about that, what you discovered about people's inherent cultural drives or tendencies towards wanting to be with their grief or their bereavement, and where that ran up against systems. Because I feel like, I'm sure it's more extreme in the prison system, but I feel like that conflict is what most of us face kind of even outside the walls of a prison system.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say, because this was one of the first things that I didn't understand, which was what the heck is the difference between a jail and a prison?
Yeah.
And because there's jail chaplains and then there's prison chaplains, and the way that they function is a little bit different. So a jail is equivalent basically to an emergency room,
Yes.
where a prison is like inpatient. You're admitted to the hospital. And so if you kind of think about the differences in how a person is treated in the ER versus if you're admitted to the hospital, there's a lot of similarities between the jails and the prisons. And so I worked in one of America's 25 largest jail systems in Hamilton County, Ohio. It's the Cincinnati area. And I was one of many chaplains that were stationed there. I am Jewish, but chaplains, in case people don't realize, this is another common misconception, particularly from the part of the country where I was from. The assumption is often that a chaplain is like a minister or a pastor, and that is not what a chaplain is or does, and they're not rooted in that. Their goal is to support your spiritual beliefs, whatever they are for you, and it doesn't really have anything to do with what mine are. But because I was Jewish, I handled all of the people experiencing incarceration that were Jewish or Muslim, basically all the non-Christians, they gave to me.
Okay.
And so that was also a little bit of a unique experience in and of itself because of the different frameworks that come into play.
Yeah. Before you dive a little deeper into what you saw or experienced, I want to reverse this, actually. I didn't even think to ask you this question originally, which is, what on earth made you think, yes, this is the work that I want to sign up for? What led you to even taking a role like that? What was your curiosity? What were the circumstances?
Gosh, when I was in my early 20s, my first job out of college, I worked for a family friend, and it was at an architecture and engineering firm. And I worked specifically in the division that built prisons and safe rooms and barracks. And so I had at one point security clearance so I could go onto bases because that was part of my job. And I was involved with the Society of American Military Engineers for many years. Anyway, so I learned about the physical structures there. And then that led to me getting involved with a nonprofit. At the time, it was called the Ohio Green Prison Project, which was kind of like an advocacy group. And then as my thanatological work formed and started developing, people experiencing incarceration are a vulnerable population. And I would argue that anyone that is incarcerated for any reason has navigated a loss.
Yes.
There's loss there of some kind somewhere.
I would say multiple. I would even
Absolutely.
go out on a limb saying multiple losses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's important to me to try to care for those that are most vulnerable.
Gotcha. Thank you for, I just thought it was like I sort of skipped over maybe some of the juicy part, which is just because it's not, although like I talked with DS Devin Moss last season, who accompanied a man on death row as a chaplain, as a non-theist chaplain. So it's not that we haven't had that conversation on the show before, but I think for our general audience, maybe that's not a profession or even a population that maybe they've thought of, although maybe many of our listeners have had or themselves been a loved one in the jail or prison system. And, firsthand the way systems can and can't allow people to feel supported in their bereavement. So thank you now we're back there, and you're showing up in this role, working mostly with Jewish population, Muslim population, sort of any other than Christian that the system sent you.
Yeah. So I also had all of the Hebrew Israelites as well. And so that was a unique subset because in Cincinnati, Ohio, most of the individuals that were experiencing incarceration were Christian-based or attached to Christianity. And one of the challenges and the pressures I dealt with from the staff versus the needs of the population, and this might be surprising for people to hear, but when you are incarcerated, you get food. Food is provided to you.
Yes.
If you have a religious designation, you can get a kosher meal. And a lot of times those meals are better quality because they're prepared under kosher supervision and they tend to be higher quality. And so everybody wants better food. And so one of the challenges, and this happens in every facility, is you have incarcerated people that are converting to a different faith tradition, which would allow them access to meals. And it was difficult as a human person trying to comfort the afflicted to help provide support to people that are in a terrible situation, while also dealing with pressures from staff who were saying, cut it off, don't allow this. We need you to say that this is not their faith tradition. And that's a very common experience. And this is why I think a lot of people, it's hard to work in environments like that because there's not a lot of soft corners or edges.
And it sounds like you in that role as chaplain, which I can imagine happens, by the way, in other kinds of systems, hospital systems like nurses, et cetera, social workers, chaplains, where you're sort of in the middle between the system,
the needs of the system
versus the needs of the patient, client, whoever,
of the people who are
you're serving.
The system.
Yes.
Like in the system.
Yeah.
And so that was particularly challenging. And when I was going through a unit of CPE, which is clinical pastoral education in the United States, in order to become a board certified chaplain, you need to have 4 units of CPE, clinical pastoral education. And so I was in my first unit of CPE while I was at the jail. And I was really grateful for that because it gave me a space to process these really intense conflicts of interest that I was having to navigate while also tending to the grief. And then I myself needed a place to process what I was experiencing, but being able to process that outward with other chaplain colleagues was priceless. And definitely in chaplaincy, we call this formation. How are you formed? And so that was absolutely integral to my formation as a thanatologist, was being able to have relationships with colleagues and be able to talk openly about how hard it is to work with a vulnerable population.
This might be getting too, inside baseball or nerdy, but I think about social workers always have clinical supervision. And so it sounds like for chaplaincy, there's a version of that as well.
Yep. It's very, very similar. I believe you guys have, I think social workers, you have to write up like cases, right?
Yeah.
And then your colleagues read them. Yep. That's in chaplaincy as well.
Yeah. So what were some of the early cases like, or sort of if you think about the themes across your time working with incarcerated populations in terms of both maybe the losses that they experience in their life outside the jail that might have ended resulting in the behavior or getting them into the system, but also the very loss that happens by the nature of entering the system, the loss of freedom, the loss of family connection, the loss of your ability to go to funeral services outside when, all those losses too. But were there some themes that you discovered or surprising cases that still stick with you to this day?
The loss of home all the time, because anytime someone is incarcerated, they have a place that they live, that they're no longer there. And if you're not able to work, you're not able to pay rent. And so a lot of folks that were incarcerated were on the inside now and finding out that their kids and their spouse or their partner were being evicted because there was no rent. And then they would have no home to come back to. And then all of their things were put out on the street. And so it's this loss of home, this kind of repeated pattern of constant home instability. Actually, earlier this year, I live in Los Angeles. And earlier this year, my husband and I went through an illegal eviction. And we had to move in 11 days, just about 11 days. Our entire home, entire garden, had to find a new place to live. I couldn't believe this was happening at our age, stable people. We'd owned a house for 10 years before we relocated out here. And I experienced firsthand the complete life disruption of not having a home base and having it thrown kind of away. And anyway, I just bring that up because I think a lot of people maybe don't realize how common disruption of home is. And it doesn't just happen to people that are incarcerated. It happens all the time. And particularly in big cities like Los Angeles, where there's lots of housing issues, as is true in many major cities. So yeah, loss of home, I would say, was a big theme. And it's probably not something most people would even think about in relationship to thinking about people that are dealing with incarceration. But a lot of them don't have a home to go back to, because the byproduct of being incarcerated for any period of time is you're ripped away from it.
Yeah. And we think often, I mean, for those of us who've experienced, a death loss, a partner, a parent, a neighbor, a sibling, I think so often the theme of my work with people is around this experience of feeling like the ground has been pulled out from beneath us and that we're untethered. That's the way I would have described the early phase of my grief, feeling untethered from the world. And that is a kind of a spiritual, emotional existence and experience. And then for these folks, they're having the literal sort of ground pulled out from underneath them, and the layer that adds to their grief.
And home is dignity, and having a right to your possessions is dignity. And it's so undignified that so many people that we're putting into a system to rehabilitate under the guise of rehabilitation, but we're ripping away their homes and their possessions, and they're losing everything. It's very undignified. It's very undignified.
It is. And, we're not here to debate the merits of, our legal system, although I certainly have my opinions on that. But I think one of the things I've been curious about and again, I'm thinking back to some of the conversations I had with Devin about the case that he worked, although you're working with a lot of more people in a less extraordinary case, right? Not somebody on death row, is what was the level of people's ability to identify their own grief as they were experiencing it? Was it about grief over things like not having home, or maybe their spouse and their kids being evicted while they're in prison? Or was it about death losses that were happening outside of the jail or prison walls that they couldn't attend the services for? What did you notice about people's even capacity to name it as grief or understand the experience that they were going through?
Yeah. So in order for me to meet with somebody, it'd have to be a request. They had to literally fill out a piece of paper. And I think that's important because I think sometimes people don't know, like, what does it actually look like to like do this? Like, you just like walk into a room and you're like, hey, chaplain's here. No. So I would come in for my shift and I'd have a stack of requests. I would look up what unit they were on, and I would map out how I was going to go through the jail, because it was multiple floors, and then there were different security levels. And so there was different stuff you had to do sometimes to get into them. So I would make my map out, but then I would also use my map informed by what was written on the piece of paper, because sometimes the requests were like, I just want to talk to a chaplain. And sometimes the requests were very specific with very specific details. And so I would use that too. Many times when I would get to know somebody, this was almost always after more than one visit.
Yes.
The person, I would say, I think you might be grieving because you've lost a lot. And a lot of times it would be, well, nobody died. Like, well, but there's other types of loss. There's shadow losses. And that, I think, was in a moment where, for myself as a chaplain, where, that's proof in the pudding of the importance of grief literacy.
Yes.
Because if you just give people some more vocabulary, words make the world easier to navigate when you have a word or a name for something, and it saves emotional labor when you can just say, this was a shadow loss or what have you.
It saves self-gaslighting,
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And basically what that is giving anybody a word is giving them a tool in their toolbox, and they can choose whether or not to use that word to describe their own lived experience. And I think that is how I would answer that question. That was probably very simple. It's the little stuff. It's just taking the time to listen and then say, hey, have you heard of this thing? Do you think that describes you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, I think those of us who watch TV, and we're usually watching shows that, of course, are dramatized because Hollywood, and it's usually prisons, maybe not jails. But either way, I think we think about the sort of need to have a tough guy attitude, to not show emotions, to not be weak and vulnerable. So I just wondered, as you sort of zoom out and looked at the culture at the particular jail that you worked, how was it perceived for people to be calling the chaplain in to talk with them? Was there kind of an amongst the population, not necessarily in this, it sounds like the system wasn't such a fan, but amongst the population, what did you notice about sort of the culture within? When we come back, Cole explains how the culture of the jail, which includes the policies and the systems, impacted how she showed up for inmates who were grieving. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Friends, I've been dreaming of showing up for you and with you in new ways. Now, don't panic. This show isn't going anywhere. Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast will keep coming to you weekly. Over the past 5 years, I've written and distributed a traditional newsletter, the not-so-regular newsletter, for a large community of readers. I've done my best to make it feel intimate and personal, and the response has been beautiful. And yet, more than ever, I am passionate about creating meaningful community and offering you more insights into my work. I want a place to explore more topics in depth. I'm hoping to expand my creative expressions to include long-form essays, audio and video guided practices, a place to host some behind the scenes of the podcast, and eventually a Dear Lisa column. And more importantly, I want to build an authentic, interactive community off social media. Life is happening so fast, and I want a place where we can slow down, dive in deeper, and figure out how to metabolize it all together. And I'd love to have you join me. So I've let go of my traditional newsletter and have launched a new Substack called AFCO with Lisa Keefauver. Now, AFCO, if you haven't heard me talk about it in my book, from the stage, or even here on the podcast, it stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yes, of course, I had to get in a judicious use of cussing. And rest assured, my friends, like I do in all my work, I will show up authentically and offer thoughtful, meaningful, and practical guidance on how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. I look forward to your comments, our chats, creating special audio and video content, and so much more. And don't worry, if you like things delivered to your inbox without having to search all over the web for it, I've got you covered. It will be delivered directly to you. Now you can head to Substack and sign up at afgoWithLisaKeefauver.substack.com, or head to my website at lisakeefauver.com to sign up, or check the link in the show notes for today's episode.
So I serve both men and women in the men's and women's units. And so there's some differences there that I think you could imagine. Many times, so sometimes when somebody would request a chaplain, sometimes it was just a man wanting to talk to a woman. So that's part of it. That's something you have to go through training for.
Yeah.
But I had a little bit of a different treatment and experience because of my appearance at the time. So I have some visible tattoos, and I had mostly a shaved head at the time. And that actually made me a more accessible chaplain because nobody thought that I was like a clean, goody two-shoe Christian lady.
Yeah.
I can just be direct about that.
Yes, please. Yeah.
And I think, and I say this to hopefully somebody will listen, where if you look like that or you don't look a certain way, we need people like you that are in this sort of work, people that don't look like everybody else. It's really important.
Yeah.
So that made me more accessible to people and far more comfortable to talk to, for sure. And so I also just say that too, because I think sometimes, all of us live in a body and none of us got to choose what we look like. And in some situations, that body that you're in that you didn't have a choice about can be a benefit and can be a negative. And I think it's a very practical thing to do, to look at how you look and think about the environments where it can serve a situation or be an environment that it won't help,
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. You brought up this term shadow losses, and I'd love for you to, and you talk about it in your book, A Guide to Grief as well, just thinking about, I'm understanding that you are referring to it in a way that we often refer to as maybe secondary losses or some of the ambiguous losses that we experience that are non-death losses or losses of things we had a reason to expect to happen but never came to pass. How do you think about the term shadow losses, and what do we need to know, the listeners and I, about how you think about that?
Yeah. So for anyone that has a clinical background, you're going to be familiar with the terms secondary loss and ambiguous loss. Dr. Pauline Boss's work. Those are clinical terms developed by clinicians within either scientific or academic environments and in relationship to other clinical terms. And they're utilized as a diagnostic term. It means that you have a professional that assigns it to somebody else. And then they're also attached in a web to other terms and terminology. Shadow loss is a non-clinical term. It is not a diagnosis. You cannot be diagnosed with it. It is only something that you can choose to say for yourself, that you can claim for yourself. So there's two types of loss, and I'm speaking non-clinical terminology. There's death losses, which is the death of a person or an animal. We have a dead body. And then there's shadow losses, which is the death of something, not someone. And the value in having a non-clinical term that somebody can use to describe their own lived experience is being able to save emotional labor. You can just say, my divorce was a shadow loss, instead of saying, well, my divorce, this is what happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened.
Again, words make worlds. So to have a word that really helps orient everybody in the conversation to the same world is really powerful. Yeah.
And like one of the challenges with non-clinicians, particularly with words like ambiguous and secondary, is non-professional people only know what ambiguous and secondary means in common language. So secondary means less than, and ambiguous means not really sure. But that's not the experience of people that are navigating a loss. And many times the secondary losses, this is clinical, are more impactful than the primary loss.
Absolutely. I would agree with that 100%. Yeah.
So as a clinician myself, I am always cognizant of making sure that I'm using non-clinical language in environments where I'm not with, other professionals, because it can be confusing. It can be harmful sometimes for people who we're using those words with and terms, but they don't have the full framework to understand the assessment, diagnosis, treatment model that they're framed under.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I felt like that's one of the things that made your book differentiated from some of the other grief guide books, mine included, right? So is really kind of getting to some core phrases, everyday language that really helps people see themselves in the various aspects and various experiences of losses. So I think that's really important. What makes the griever a vulnerable population? Like, how do you think about that? Because that's one of the other things we had touched on before hopping on to record today. And I'm really excited to sort of explore with you. Excited maybe is the wrong word, but I think it's a really
I like excited. Well, this is our field.
This is our field, but I think it's so important again, when we think about, we don't exist, we exist each in these individual bodies, but we exist in all kinds of levels of systems, of political systems, of legal systems, of medical systems, of family systems, of community, of religious, and to not understand our vulnerability within those locations means we cause unnecessary suffering. That's my...
Yep. And we want to, as I always say, we want to reduce the chance of inadvertently causing harm to others or to ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so vulnerable population. That means if someone is vulnerable, it means that they're more likely to be exposed to harm. It's probably a really good, simple way to put it. Now, we know that the dying are a vulnerable population, because as you get closer to death, you lose capacity, decision-making, you lose sensory input sometimes. And so if you have less than what other people have, you're at a disadvantage. That's another way of kind of talking about what the heck does this mean. But grievers are also a vulnerable population, because we know that when we're grieving, the brain is under stress. And when the grief response is activated, we have signs of grief across 6 different categories: cognitive, physical, emotional, spiritual, social, and behavioral. So you're having all of these changes where you are not your, quote, normal self while you are navigating through the grief response. And that means that you are vulnerable. This is why it is unethical to the day after somebody's spouse dies or mother dies, you do not try to sell them life insurance. That's wrong to do that, right? Because you're a vulnerable population.
Yeah.
And
or
I just
$3,000, $10,000 casket,
or I mean, any of that stuff. It's so tricky to navigate that. So, and I say this as someone who comes from American Funeral Service as well. So, and it's like, girl, it's rough.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But to be aware of that vulnerability, both as whether anybody listening today is a family member, whether you're a provider in one of the systems that might touch a griever, which, by the way, includes just every place of employment, because we're forcing people to go back to work the next day, 3 days later. If you're lucky, 2 weeks later. I had to go back to work 2 weeks after my husband died, and I didn't get paid in the interim, right? So this goes out to all of us, for us to remember that how we approach conversations, how we approach decision-making with a griever in our lives in whatever scenario is important to remember that they are vulnerable, but also to us listening for ourselves as grievers, to understand our own vulnerability and to have some grace for our own vulnerability, which, invites us to think about who are the trusted people in our lives who can act in concert with us, or as our advocate, or as our the person who's kind of filtering all the information, because I think that it doesn't always happen, certainly.
Yep. And another area that I look at this, and I have a filter myself at the School of American Thanatology, is when we're offering like a training program and we ask people if they're recently bereaved, because sometimes we're recently bereaved and we're like, oh my God, I'm going to become a death doula and I'm going to jump into this. And we have restrictions like around that, because I think that there's an ethical concern with taking somebody's money when they're hurting and trying to like fix the pain of the grief that comes with it. And it's like, you gotta have some distance. You gotta sit in it for a while. You gotta sit in it.
I think that's I love that you're practicing what you preach. No pun intended, chaplain. But they're around because some of that, like, quote unquote, taking an advantage of a vulnerable population is not coming with malicious intent, right? But still, you're saying we understand your pull, and we also, even though you maybe don't see it right now, understand that this is like a big decision, financial commitment, time, etc., and then it's not maybe the time to do that. And I think I see that time and time again, people wanting to do it for lots of reasons, and eventually a lot of people, I imagine, come back and do. But also, if many people in Western culture, maybe this is our gateway to sort of culture and nationality and how that frames how we grieve or not, like to process grief, or hope to process grief, by just learning more and intellectualizing our way through grief. I'm raising my hand here if you're watching on YouTube. Guilty as charged, for sure. I think a lot of us are. We want to learn our way through the pain and the discomfort.
That's my go-to.
Right.
I'm like, I have pain. Let me
go learn about it. Right.
There's certification.
I always want to do the both and. Everybody knows that I love a both and, because just like my TED Talk title is called, I do believe knowing more about grief can make it suck less.
And yes,
it is not a bypass to feeling the feels or sitting in the suck, as one of my guests once called it, which I thought was a great expression, right? And to metabolizing our grief. But our propensity to intellectualize our grief, again, goes back to what we were talking about earlier. There was an earlier version of us 60 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, versions of us in other cultures that knew intuitively that grief, to be metabolized, is to move through us physically, has an impact, that we're not meant to do it alone, that we're meant to do it in community, that it takes up time and long period of time, that it is not a 5 stages and voila, you're done, right? So what have you been studying or curious about or learning about how the containers that we're in, which I'll just use culture as a generic term, but that means a lot of things, impacts how we think about our grief, and the resources and or tools that we have to even begin to know where to begin? Yeah.
So there are 3 factors that I've identified through my research that have to do with why there seems to be less like community inbuilt natural support.
Yes. Yeah.
And they are religion, jobs, and moving. So, number one, religion. In the United States, we're either becoming super hyper religious and we're in these like very insular
Small
communities,
enclaves, yeah.
or we're not religious at all. It's more like, I think more than 1 in 4 Americans now are
Atheists
nothing, or like
agnostic,
secular,
at least
non-religious,
secular, yeah.
spiritual. And one of the perks that comes with being attached to a religious community is inbuilt support. You have a place to go if somebody died. A lot of these places have bereavement communities that are a part of the organization. And so if you're not religious, you're not able to benefit from some of those social resources that come through those communities.
It's not built in and automatic in the way that it had been for those of us across the centuries who were part of those communities. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
The second factor is moving. Americans are more likely to live away from the tiny town or the city that your mom's generation and your grandma's generation were from. Americans are more likely to not live in the state that they were from. I think in Nevada, it's something like 80% of Nevadans are not originally from Nevada, something huge, like it's a huge number. And so there is a social capital, a social benefit, a social support benefit that comes when you are in the place where you're from still. So I live in Los Angeles, but my family is in Cincinnati, Kentucky, and West Virginia, and they are too far away. If there's a problem for me to quickly have support, there's a huge barrier to that support. And then the third factor is jobs. Americans are more likely to change jobs more often throughout their working lives. And just using my dad as an example, he worked for the same company for 40 years. So he had 40 years of history with coworkers and colleagues. Anytime there was an issue in our family, good or bad, a win or a loss, he also had coworker support that was there. They checked on him. Because you have an actual community there when you're staying in the same company for a long time. So in the US, what are we supposed to do with this? We have less community in our jobs, less community in a religious sense, and many of us have less community because we've moved away from them. And so this is why I think the pandemic brought everything online, and we're coming back into reality, into the real world. And many of us are like, oh I'm lonely. I don't know anybody. These third places have also closed up. There's not the mall that we can go to on the weekends and meet friends like we did when we were kids.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge challenge that we have in the US in terms of we have fewer spaces that are containers for bereavement support.
And I was just about to say that. I mean, we could say like that's the decline of, like Western civilization, and to the relationship to bereavement and to grieving. Again, we are not meant to be doing it alone. We're meant to be held and contained and seen and witnessed in our grief. And that takes so much now more inertia, more navigating, maybe transportation, maybe cost, maybe time.
Yeah.
In a way, at a time when you are overwhelmed by energy, like an energy drain, you're probably overwhelmed by the financial burdens of processing the death loss. So that's sort of a perfect storm, I think, in a way, for the challenges to navigating a bereavement with more ease, I'll say. I always say, like, grief sucks, but a lot of what happens in the systems, our grief illiterate culture, and in the systems that you just described, or just the very nature of the cultural systems we describe, is we make it unnecessarily sucky, right? We unnecessarily cause harm and suffering. If you were thinking about kind of the creating a culture, because I think you've traveled abroad and worked abroad too, but when you think about, I mean, maybe it's just the answer is the opposite of the three things you named, but when you see cultures or systems that have a more grief-rich environment, what does that look like? Have you seen that happen in practice? What have you noticed? You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. When we come back, Cole gives a personal example about how we participate in and even create cultures that are supportive to us in grief. She explains this often requires us to step outside of our familiar patterns and tendencies to retreat. When we come back, Cole gives a personal example about how we participate in and even create cultures that are supportive to us in grief. She explains this often requires us to step outside of our familiar patterns and tendencies, which for many of us is to retreat. Since you're listening to the show, you know that navigating the messy reality of grief in a world obsessed with top 10 lists and productivity can, well, feel lonely and confusing. That's why in my new book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss, I created a safe place to be inside the messiness of it all. I've been told that it feels like your wise best friend offering you a comprehensive and compassionate guide to navigating loss. I so appreciate those words. I share personal and professional wisdom alongside the lessons I've learned from clinicians, authors, poets, friends, and even guests on this show. In place of rigid instructions and must-do checklists, this book invites reflections, encourages self-compassion, and explores the therapeutic power of humor with, yes, a bit of profanity. One reader recently shared this. This was the best, most useful grief book I've read, and I've read many. What's so unique is that it blends the author's personal experience of loss, grief, and healing, her extensive investigation into grief resources and theories, and a remarkable, empathetic, caring, and compassionate voice. Keefauver wrote this book to help grievers, including those in acute and traumatic grief, not to contribute to the grief canon. And that purpose comes across. This book is practical, uplifting, and well-organized in a field of books that often miss the mark. Highly recommended. Thank you, reader. I appreciate it every time someone leaves a review. Now, you can pick up your copy at your favorite independent bookstore, online bookseller, or even on your next trip, as it's in more than 50 airport bookstores across the country. I've linked it in the show notes, too, for today's episode. And thanks to my friends at the Hachette Publishing Group, my UK listeners can find it on bookshelves there, too. Oh, and if you like listening instead of reading, which still counts, by the way, I narrated the book, too, so you can take me on your next walk with you by heading to Audible or wherever you get your audiobooks. Writing is one beautiful way to creatively explore your loss. But as we heard from a previous guest, Jamie Thrower, ritual and creativity can also help us metabolize our sorrow. That's why I am thrilled to share that Jamie and I are teaming up and offering a place of shelter in the overwhelm, exploring how we create a safe and sacred container for our grief. Alongside an intimate gathering of fellow grievers, we'll explore and learn about these 5 themes: the cross-cultural history and benefits of rituals in grief, key elements involved in altar building, the role of creativity in metabolizing and alchemizing our sorrow, the positive impact of creative activities on our nervous system, and finally, how mindfulness of the stories we tell ourselves and others can help us hold the weight of grief. This is a 3-hour online, interactive, and intimate workshop experience. Together, we will explore the importance of rituals and creativity in grief by listening, watching, talking, writing, drawing, creating, playing, meditating, and most of all, gathering in sacred community with one another. To sign up for this workshop or learn about future offerings, visit lisakeefauver.com/workshops and events.
So I think I will share a personal story.
Yes, please. Yes.
Here. So my husband and I, we've been together for 21 years, and we've been together since I was a teenager. Been together my whole adult life with this man. And we were in northern Kentucky, and the pandemic, it was like 2021, and we were like, I think if we're going to make a change in life, try something new, now is the time. And so we made a decision to relocate to Los Angeles from northern Kentucky at that time and see what the next 20 years together has in store for us. And Los Angeles is known for having a lot of transplants. And I left Northern Kentucky, which a lot of my friends and family there had been there for generations. It's not a place that people are like, let's move to Northern Kentucky. Like, it's just not on people's radar. So one of the first things that I did when I relocated here, because I know about this from my thanatological work, is the importance of establishing a community. And it's very hard to establish a community for yourself as an adult. I moved to a city where I knew a few people, but I didn't really know many people. And I also think that when we move places, the first question if I invited you to my house, the first thing you would not do when you walk into my house was look around and say, what could Cole and Cole's house give me? Usually we show up with a bottle of wine. We offer something to our host first. So when you relocate to a city or a town, I think the first question you should ask is, what can I give to my new community, rather than what is Los Angeles going to give me? And that is also a skill to some extent that isn't really taught culturally today, that teaching that. Rather than asking, what are you going to get? Ask, what are you going to give? And so when I relocated here, gardening is a really important hobby for me. It also is a really important mental health maintenance tool that I have had throughout my entire life and the extent of my entire career. So I applied and I got accepted to the California Master Gardener program. It was like a 6-month training course. I have to give the state at least 50 hours of my time every year in order to keep my certification active. And so I became a California Master Gardener, and I've given more than 200 hours in 2024 back to Los Angeles just in my time. And what it has given me is tenfold. I have deep relationships with people that I see every single week that's not at my job, that's not my family, that's not even my friend group. And I'll tell you what, when I had my first book published in October, it was all the garden people that were right at the front door, ready to celebrate and cheers me and with copies in hand. And so I don't know if that's a good way to illustrate it, but I think that, number one, we have to have time for hobbies and passions. And there is a lot of privilege that comes with being able to have that as an option. Yeah. But that is where that source of community can come from, that isn't attached all the time to your family or friend group or coworkers.
Oh, I think that's really important. And if you're a new griever, you're thinking, I don't have time to go volunteer, give energy. And I think I want to just zoom out and say, I think what I hear you saying, and I think about this all the time, and I'm a relatively new transplant to my neck of the woods, and I had to get through cancer treatment first, but I'm in this space right now of really building community here. Is part of just zooming out, like part of the reason culturally we all struggle so much, generally speaking, is because we don't have that. So one of the antidotes going forward, because we're all going to face more losses throughout our lives, is to invest in community building, play, that kind of thing, so that we are fortifying our environment, so that when we cross that threshold again, or somebody we love or a neighbor crosses that threshold again, we've created a more supportive environment to navigate that loss. Yeah.
Yes. And I think you just got to look at what you love. So if you love to read, find your local Friends of the Library Association. You're going to meet other people with like-minded interests. You're going to be able to meaningfully connect with. If you love cooking, there's of course food kitchens, but there's also a lot of restaurants that have some form of outreach that they just individually do. Yes. And I think what's really key, though, is invest in something that you enjoy. Like, I legit love gardening. Sometimes I show up for my shifts and I don't want to talk to anybody. So I say, hey, and I go about deadheading or weeding completely on my own. Other times I'm ready to chit chat for 3 hours.
Yeah.
It's having those spaces. Most people don't realize, I think, that a regular volunteer commitment can actually give you a lot of social breathing room. If you want space or if you want connection, it's there. So
no, I appreciate that. I want to touch a little bit on the book, which I think you did. One of the things I hoped to try to do, very different books, I think, but similar, like in the family, as I would say. I would say also this reminded me a little bit of the Good Morning, the ladies who wrote Good Morning, that book as well. Because, I mean, even if you're just watching on YouTube again, it's like sort of very like large print and spacious, great for the grieving brain who has a hard time. I didn't read a book for the first year. I always share. And then the first book I could read after a year was Tina Fey's bossy pants, which,
Yes.
I know, because humor is always a
Perfect
good answer.
choice. Yes.
But one of the things, so I just wanted to note that, and I love that because, again, you were really attending to, there's a couple of things as I hear the conversation has unfolded today that really is reflected in the book as well, which is really recognizing the grief brain and sort of attending to that as in just the form in which you wrote the book. But you also do a really beautiful job of not getting into the, as you said, the clinical language. You sort of differentiate death loss and shadow loss right up front I think in the introduction.
Right
in the introduction in the book. You talk about grief energy, and you also do a lot of sort of prompts. And one of the things that you ask yourself, and this will come out in the spring of 2025, but we're recording just as we approach the holidays here in the Christmas holidays, Hanukkah, and all the holidays, some prompts or like inventory taking. And one of the ones that I stumbled upon that I had sticky noted, you can see there's a lot, but cool. Which I think is really some key questions when I think about the practicality from your book, from mine, from others, but just a reminder to us to not get stuck in your intellect, to get into the practice of it, which is like, what's my grief energy like today? And how can I keep my grief moving today? I think I work with individuals as a grief supporter. So, and I know you do that work too. And I think there's a place for that. Grief support groups, great place.
Yep.
I'm starting a grief and movement and ritual community here in 2025. I think there's all kinds of places and spaces. And at the end of the day, I always want to empower all of us to begin to build the skills that we can do in the quiet moments, at the 3 a.m. moments when nobody else is in the home, in the moments where we're not in between sessions. And one of the things I love is just some of these questions that we might ask ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. Like, how do I notice my grief energy today? Yeah.
Yes.
What was important about the prompts for you? Yeah.
So in writing this book is for 10 to 14-year-olds. And so one of the challenges of writing for that age group is your readers that you're writing for they're not buying the books. It has to go through a caregiver or an adult.
Yes.
And so that's why it's kind of it can be a tough nut to crack.
Yes.
Is writing something for that age group, but it's got to be parsed by adults first. So, and then the other thing too is much of the content that is out there for that age group is very clinicized because it's coming from clinicians. But
yes.
Most kids haven't yet had anybody be like, there's 2 types of loss.
Yeah.
And then grief is this, but grief is not being sad. Grief is not an emotion. Emotions are a part of grief. Like just this brass tacks. And then the other thing too is at this age group, 10 to 14-year-olds, one of the important developmental lessons that they're navigating is learning their own space versus others. They're learning their differences between their families and themselves, how they're different from their classmates in kind of bigger ways. And there is no really space in culture that teaches kids how you can have grief privately and publicly.
Yes.
We don't teach that. And so one of the prompts in there is talking about how you can have a space to remember what you lost. You could even do it in a desk drawer, or you could draw it out in a notebook because it's really important for kids to learn privacy and that it's okay that they can have things that are just for them and they don't share with others. That's why I talk about inside grief versus outside grief.
I love that distinction. Yeah.
Because you remember you're talking to a younger person, but I find that a lot of the adults that have read
I was just about to say,
they're like, I haven't given this to my child yet because I was healing my inner child who never got any of this. And that is
the principles in this book. I mean, I can see that it was written to a teen in the sort of more like non-clinical, shorter segments, maybe like easier, more everyday language. And to your point just now, I want to name, I think this is a relevant book for any age in that I think these are core principles that most of us, until we faced our own loss, really haven't had nobody's talked with us about that, and we don't have a chance to learn that. So, yeah.
And one of the things that I made sure to include in the book that I fought for a little bit was there's a section in the book where I talk about if you find out that your teacher at school, their mom died. We have to teach kids like appropriate emotional responses and like also like you didn't know that person. And so you don't have to be steamrolled because your teacher's mother died. It's like how do we teach kids appropriate responses and how do we teach them these regulation techniques so that they're not steamrolled by you're gonna hear about other people's losses your entire life, but there's a difference between it being another person's loss versus your loss. And where are we teaching this in society to our young people? So that's, I guess you, Lisa, I'm sure you have read more of these texts for this age group, but I keep
this is one of the first
feedback.
books. No, this is one of the first books, to be honest, that I've read for the teen. You know, I've read a lot of like kids books, maybe like elementary
like
age.
Young,
you know, like of course, all the beautiful work that Brennan Wood and the Dougie Center offers.
Yes,
Brennan.
and they're a resource.
Okay, in here.
Brennan stuff.
But you're really one of the first ones that I think is approaching this particular age group that I've had the chance to read over these last 6 seasons. And that's why I just was so excited to have you on, because I think that's like, if we can crack that nut at that age, if we can teach, you know, as kids that age are experiencing a profound loss and having all the developmental, you know, issues that come with that fun time of being a teen, you know, a tween, but kind of lay in some grief literacy, some emotional regulation. What a different next generation we're going to have.
Yep, absolutely. And I even found that like some of my colleagues who are clinicians, because this book had 8 different peer reviewers, you know, some of these people were PhDs, and they were like, this broke down stuff that I never had. I never even needed to break it down before.
Yes.
And that was really helpful to hear, because my editor, Patricia Ocampo from Kids Can Press, which is the publisher, she's the one who acquired this text, and she has kids that are this age group. And that was something that, cause I always like to say, there's like other people behind books. It wasn't just like,
so
I didn't
many
just
people.
like,
it
didn't disappear. There's a whole team of people behind this, but they really all fought for this text being kind of, it's secularly rooted, but it does address religion, but it is not rooted in a religious perspective, if that makes sense. Because that's another thing, kids, how are they taught this?
Yes.
Kids need to be taught that some people will view a loss or grief through a religious context, and it might be different than yours. And then what do you do about that? How do you respond to that? So there's all these, it was actually such a gift to be able to be immersed in thinking about, what does a 10 to 14-year-old need to know about grief and loss? And as a clinician, for me, with all this like stuff behind me, it was really helpful to be like, you got to speak plain language. You got to not use jargon and $10 words. And you got to talk to people that don't have any of that fancy schmancy stuff, because that's what we had before. And we got to make sure that we have a place for that. So,
no, I really do. I really appreciate the way you approached the book. And if you're listening and you have a teen or tween, and, you know, maybe their loss was earlier, but you've not felt like you had a resource for them, I really encourage you to get it now. The content in this book could be as equally as valuable to a teen or a tween who just experienced a loss just now, or even one. I mean, I'm thinking like, my daughter was 7 when my husband died, but if this had come along in her tweens, because as she matured and evolved, then, you know, grief moves in different cycles as we age and go through developmental milestones. I wish I would have had this, but I mean, I'm already going to lend it to her, and she's 21, you know, and she knows enough, because now, you know, she's my daughter. So she's like, enough already with the grief stuff. But I really think it's not too late to really get some core competencies. And also I would say, man, if you are do they call it junior high anymore? Middle school, whatever. If you're a middle school teacher out there, you need to have this book, read it for yourself, and also just have it on loan in your school library, because I think this is going to be really helpful for the friend of the kid whose brother or mother died, as much as for the kid whose sibling or parent or grandparent died.
Well, and that's also because adults, how do we get information on how to break this big stuff down, loss and grief? How do you break that down and explain that in a way that's age appropriate? You know, like, this is what's interesting, because I'm a thanatologist, right? And so we dealt with, how do we explain what thanatology is in the book? Because it's an academic scientific word. It's not like a real life word. And this age group, it will do nothing for them to know that a thanatologist wrote this book. You know what I mean? And so even just starting there, thinking back through that kind of stuff, it was really valuable.
That's awesome. Well, I know we're closing, but maybe I'll move this to the front of the episode later, or maybe we'll just leave it right here if you're listening at the end, and that's what I decided to do. But tell us, what is a thanatologist? How would you describe that? What's the definition?
So thanatology is the study of death, dying, grief, and loss. And the word thanatology is about 115 years old. It was only coined last century. And also gerontology was coined at the same time, which is the study of age and aging. Thanatology is kind of an academic field and a scientific field, and it is different around the world. So American thanatologists are different than Italian thanatologists than my colleagues in Russia or in the UK, because thanatology is informed by the culture it inhabits,
Yes.
and language holds how we communicate about loss and grief. And for example, English and Spanish, the word grief does not directly translate between English and Spanish. And so the way that those concepts are contained within a language is a reflection of the culture.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean when I say thanatology is not the same around the world, even though it is the study of the same sort of stuff.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And what a great theme, and coming back around to sort of the theme that we've touched on throughout our conversation today, which is sort of the cultural location of where you're grieving informs how you're grieving, how you're supported, what meaning you're making of the loss that you are inhabiting and walking with, and how the systems then interact with all of that. So I really appreciate that as a closing conversation. Cole, I'm sure this will not be our last conversation, but thank you so much for joining me today on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch.
Thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity. And thank you for reading my book and letting me chit chat about it. I really appreciate it.
Everybody, I'm going to drop a link in the show notes for A Guide to Grief by Cole Imperi. And I want to give a shout out to the illustrator, Bianca. How do you pronounce her last name?
Bianca.
Did some really fun, great illustrations throughout the book. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, my friends, thank you so much for listening to yet another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Today with my guest, Cole Imperi. You can visit her website, coleimperi.com, to learn more about their work and pick up a copy of their fantastic book, especially designed for young teens, A Guide to Grief. Now, I do want to make a note about the timing of this episode. As you heard, we do address the loss of housing in Cole's recent move to LA. However, this episode was recorded prior to the wildfires that destroyed and devastated so many communities there. If you want to help those impacted who are deep in grief, you can donate to the California Community Foundation's Wildfire Recovery Fund. Go to calfund.org/funds/wildfire-recovery-fund, or check the link in the show notes for today's episode. Now, don't forget to look for video clips of our conversation on social media at Lisa Keefauver MSW, or if you're not already, watch us on my YouTube channel at Lisa Keefauver MSW. If you loved our conversation today, if you learned something from it, it would mean the world to me if you do just a few simple things. First and foremost, share the episode with another griever who might just need it too. You can tag me on socials if you do it there. 2, make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listened or watched so that you don't miss the next one when it drops. And finally, if you loved the show, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a 5-star rating and write a review. If you listen, you can do it on Apple Podcast. If you've watched, you can do it on my YouTube channel. I read each and every one of your reviews, and they mean the world to me. Thanks to Giles Smith of Alafia Sounds for the music you hear in our show. Hey, my grieving friends, remember that, yes, grief is a sneaky bitch, but don't worry, I've got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.